So I'm here with Dr. Douglas Boin. He's a historian of social history in the Roman Empire, right?
Yep, that's about right. History, you could say history.
Cool. You're a professor, associate professor of history at St. Louis University, and you're also a visiting researcher at the University of Texas, Austin, currently.
That's right. Yeah, I'm joining you from sometimes people say great state of Texas, but we don't need to go there.
Yeah, okay. So I was excited to have you on because you have a new book, which I'm holding right here, which is Alaric the Goth, who famously sacked Rome in 410 AD. He's like this figure that stands out so, the barbarian sacking Rome. Like there's this large image looming in our mind of who this person is. So you kind of are coming at it from a different angle, and I'd love to hear more about this book and who Alaric is and where, what's your angle here?
Yeah. So first of all, Andrew, long time fan. So first time on, I'm just thrilled to be with the Religion for Breakfast folks. I think you're doing a great job in this space. And so, I know you didn't want to hear that. You didn't need to hear that, but like you are.
Well, thanks.
Thanks for having me on.
No problem.
As far as Alaric goes, I got into this story because I was looking, 4 years ago. I just finished a project. I just finished a big textbook, and I was looking for something else to work on. And I think I came across an article in the New York Times magazine. I think it was 2015, and it was about Charles Dickens, and Charles Dickens, visiting America. And I immediately, as soon as I kind of read it, had in my mind, like, what is it like for someone from the center of a universe to go to a periphery? Or what is it like to kind of grow up in a cultured environment, hugely literate, kind of self-important environment, and then to be exposed to or to encounter a backwater or, a place that is, just so off the map, off the grid that you're just not even able to comprehend could anything positive come from where you are. And the point of this article was actually kind of really extraordinary. He had visited Ohio and the kind of like Lake Erie area, which is exactly where Toni Morrison was born. And the story was a profile of Toni Morrison and how Charles Dickens had just dismissed out of hand the fact that anything good, anything, cultured could come from this area of the globe. And, I had just finished this book on the history of Rome and a kind of global environment. And I was looking for a story that would maybe help people figure out how to put Rome into a larger global perspective. And this seemed like a good paradigm for how to kind of shift people's perspective. Instead of telling the story from the center, tell the story from the periphery. And that led me to Alaric, and the rest became the book.
That's really cool. So telling a story from the periphery. So that leads me to the next question. Like, who was Alaric? Who were the Goths? Because again, the scary boogeymen, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, totally. the sacking of Rome, but like,
the naked warriors on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the Romans did that too. Like the wounded Goth or the wounded, I don't know, whatever that famous statue is, where the stricken warrior.
Totally.
So who were these people?
The dying Gaul statue, I think, is the one you're thinking about. These people were really fascinating people to try to appreciate their experiences of. My impetus to go and learn about them was really like we were just saying, it came out of a sense of wanting to do them right, of wanting to right a wrong. Their story, their version of history has never really been put, front and center. It's always been Romans or it's always been barbarians at the gate. So the idea that the Goths, who grew up on the northeastern frontier of the Roman Empire, they lived just outside of the border of Rome, which was in their territory, the Danube River. They were, for best as we can tell, a people that had settled there and had been on that land for, a couple generations by the time we meet them in history. But they were largely very, very simple. The natural kind of comparisons are to kind of native or indigenous people, and so they didn't have writing until a missionary came from Rome and kind of helped devise a system that we still have. And they don't have a huge literature, at least that exists from Alaric's day. So it became it's understandable why they've been missing or left out of the history books for so long. They lived a very simple life, and they didn't really leave anything behind. And that, of course, made for a really challenging story.
Yeah. And so location-wise, it's modern-day Romania. What other countries are kind of encompassed by Gothia?
Gothia, ancient Gothia is how they referred to it. It's kind of the intersection of Romania, Belarus, southern Ukraine. I'm sorry, not Belarus. Bulgaria, Romania, southern Ukraine, and Moldova is in that neck of the woods. So a northern European, kind of Central Asian geography that is outside. At one point could have been Roman Empire. I think that's what, to me, was also so fascinating about starting the story is, the Romans went as far as Alaric's home and then a little bit further, but then backed off. And that, to me, just made such a fascinating, like I said, starting point, because they had colonized almost everything around where the Goths settled. And that meant Roman culture, Roman ideas, Roman values were literally right at the border. And that made the border such a kind of rich historical petri dish for seeing how customs and values traded both sides.
Yeah, and this is something I really enjoyed. Early on in the book, you kind of construct this image of the frontier, how you have the Danube River, you have Romans on one side, Goths on the other side. There's almost like we think about, it felt very relevant today with so much talk about immigration and border crossing, and there's this idea of the Danube River being this border, and how Goths, some of them really want to get into Rome for the opportunity. Romans construct this idea of the scary barbarian, so many times the Goths that were coming in were enslaved. So talk more about this border itself, the Danube River, and what was the social situation there in the late Roman Empire.
Yeah, I think hitting the notes of how it is kind of similar today were things that I had in the back of my mind when I was thinking about what sources I have for trying to describe, let's say, Alaric's childhood. Because like the first time we meet Alaric, we meet him when he's probably 18, 19, 20 years old, and he's a rebel. He's an insurgent. He's like mud on his face trying to take down a Roman emperor. How do you even begin to tell his story 20 years earlier? To me, when I was starting to think about what the sources were, I think I had to start very creatively and read a lot of modern perspective on borderlands. And it just kind of hit me at one point. It was, what's still there? What's the source? The source is the river. The river is the starting point for how these people's lives develop, because it's at both, like you said, it's a border, it's a visible thing that one side uses to keep people out. And yet for the Goths, we know that they were naturalists. They educated themselves, they learned on hunts, they skinned animals, they traded them. They, outside was like their classroom. And that was really kind of a fun portion of the book to write. But I think, that river was so important for many perspectives, because when you see it through the eyes of a 8-year-old or 10-year-old, it has so many different meanings. It shifts based upon what's happening around him. Is it a type of thing that's going to save you if you cross it? Is it the type of thing you don't want to go near because you could get picked up by a slave trader? Like, those are all the things that I wrestled with when I was trying to figure out the story points to describe how important the events were of Alaric's childhood.
Yeah, I mean, this was acutely aware to me as I was reading it too. I'm also a historian. I feel like I deal with so much more data. Like when you study like late antique Egypt, for example, you have tons of papyrus, you have tons of texts, you have famous monks that were hanging out at famous monasteries. But the Goths, there's just nothing. There's like barely any archaeological data.
Totally. I laugh. In many ways, because it's like you've got to be crazy. Like you could hear people say to me behind, it's like, why are you doing this? Why would you try to document what can't be documented? And I, like, you and I kind of know each other for a while. Like I have a love for, high degree of difficulty type projects. Like I hope that the judges out there are at least grading me on degree of difficulty
on a curve,
at some point. Yeah, because like you have to turn to fiction in order to get a sense of who the Goths were. The last biography of Alaric was written in the 1930s as a novel. It's just that simple. Like it's a lot easier to make stuff up than it is to try to find what you would need to put into a documented historical book. So, I had to get really creative. Like you said, the archaeology was paramount. I needed to read about what houses looked like. I needed to kind of follow the bioarchaeology or the zooarchaeology leads, the bones that were dug up at the riverbank, trying to figure out, hearing the scholars talk about, we found this rabbit bone and it looked like it had been boiled based upon there were no chars, or there was no kind of scarring or flame residue on the bones. Those types of details became super important to reconstruct what daily life was like, in trying to kind of picture what a meal would be like, or understand the animals that might have been in the environment. The starting point, when I started to kind of think, okay, Alaric's going to be it. Here's the story. The first thing I did was not actually read the archaeology though, and this is actually kind of interesting. I went with what most people would go to, which is Jordan's History of the Goths. And if you or your listeners, the viewers don't know that text, it's online. You can find it. It's a 6th century text about what Gothia was like, and it's just totally made up. I mean, it is just fanciful. The Goths are related to people that fought in the Trojan War. The Goths are, it's totally nuts.
It's just fiction. Yeah,
it's totally fiction. But when I read it, and I started with it because I wanted to just start with something. Like I needed a book to take with me on a trip, and I was like, okay, I'm starting it. What do? I just will take this book. The things that jumped out to me when I read it critically, when I read it skeptically, were the details about the natural world. They were the animals that were encountered. They were the amount of time that Goths spent outside. They were the natural landscape features of hunting, fishing, and all those sorts of things. So I used that as a way to then go find archaeological corroboration, the way that any historian would try to corroborate one source with another, and then go from there. So those first 2 decades of Alaric's life were just really, I tried to be as detailed as I could, even though he doesn't seem like he's there. But I mean, he's not even on the cover because we don't know what he looked like. This is really a story where he's lurking behind everything.
Yeah. And that is interesting that because of the nature of our sources, like super fictionalized, hyper biased sources like Jordan's History of the Goths, we know more about the stereotypes, like Roman stereotypes about the Goths, than we actually do about this actual people group. Because it's just so refracted through Roman, snooty views of barbarians out there beyond the Danube.
They're so dismissive. The Romans were so dismissive and just contemptuous and just disdainful that anything positive could come from outside of an olive tree. If you as soon as the olive trees vanished, you were just like, you were in no man's land. And that was true whether you went to the south, south of Egypt, south of Ethiopia, which is the kind of furthest that the classical writers could imagine for many centuries, or whether you went north of the Danube to, the Hyperboreans, the people who were beyond the north winds. So I think what also interested me in telling Alaric's story was not leaving that out. I felt like it was very important to make sure that the Goths had their stories told, but it was told in the context of the way people thought about them, the way people look down upon them. That type of stuff, would usually maybe get moved to the side in a kind of traditional Goth-centric story, maybe. But I like this idea of standing in two places at one time, or seeing two different perspectives at one time. How do you see yourself? How do others see you? Is kind of my way of accessing the historical landscape.
Yeah, and this came out really strongly in the book too, how Alaric is this man of almost two cultures, and he's a Goth from beyond the Danube, but he was thoroughly entrenched in the Roman Empire at times. If I'm a little hazy on the details, but if you can run us through real quickly, he joins the Roman military. He was at one point a provincial governor in the Roman bureaucracy, so he wasn't necessarily like this raving, frothing barbarian.
right. He's not some, scurrilous pirate or something, which is, how, you can often kind of see these guys. His trajectory is really kind of remarkable. He does start as an insurgent. I mean, like I said, when we first meet him in the thinnest line of Roman poetry, just one single line of Roman poetry, we hear that he had been responsible for trying to attack an imperial convoy in 391. And it was in the marshes of Macedonia. And so he's clearly crossed into Rome by that point, the empire by that point. And yet he's got this following that has tried to organize a takedown of a passing carriage. I mean, to me, that's a sign of, charisma. It's a sign of organizational skills. It's a sign of probably a good communicator, someone who can rally, friends and colleagues to his side. And yet within like a year of that event, we see him in the Roman army. So other people clearly saw that side of him too. And there was enough of a kind of maybe principle about him, or maybe a kind of thoughtfulness to him, that he was able to say, okay, instead of trying to tear this down, I'm going to try to be a part of what it means. And we see him join the army from that point, for the next couple years, until several of the people that he's fighting with are slaughtered indiscriminately because of a very kind of callous, calculated move on behalf of the emperor. And it starts to sow this seed in him of, did I make the right choice? Is this really the best way for me to be kind of using what I think his talents, what his talents were? And at that point, we start to see a much more complicated relationship between, how he sees himself in the Roman Empire as an immigrant, and how the Roman Empire sees him as someone trying to serve it. It's a relationship that just kind of spirals downhill from there.
And can you speak a little bit to his stint as a governor or some sort of provincial bureaucrat? Like what? Because that's like some real power he had at some point.
It is, yeah. It's really surprising to see someone born outside of the Roman Empire begin to kind of break into the upper echelons of imperial power. He's given a governorship, a kind of a military office in the province, the prefecture of Illyricum, which is this kind of jigsawed thing. I describe it in the book. I was trying to figure out how to not say gerrymandered, this kind of jigsawed land in between the East and the West that it does the most impossible geographic administrative thing, which is it touches the Danube River and it touches the Mediterranean Sea. That's, kind of a really fascinating feat. He's given a position there to work alongside the civilian authorities in the late 390s, 398, 399. And it's there really that the East and the Western empires, the emperors, don't really kind of, they never really own him. They never really kind of take responsibility or even take pride in having him there. But we know that there were many other people like him that achieved really kind of standout status. You name, one of the names that comes up is this Armenian, who becomes kind of counselor, chief executive of Constantinople at the same time. And I think these were just really important examples to put into the story of later Rome, people that came from unexpected backgrounds, had language backgrounds, whether it's Alaric with Gothic or Eunapius with or Eutropius, sorry, the Council of Constantinople came from Armenia, had some Persian background too. It was really important for me to put these people with different language skills, different geographic childhoods at the center of what life was like in later Rome, precisely because the sources that we have about their lives just vilified them. I mean, the sources are just downright ugly about what happens when a person not from Rome achieves a higher status in Rome. I mean, the poets and the commentators just kind of, they can't restrain how much of an abomination this is, how you can just hear how insulted they are that someone would think that a foreigner would be more talented than they would be. You can just get this kind of ugly sense right there on the page in your Latin and Greek classes about the cultural supremacy at the heart of the late 4th and early 5th century.
Yeah, and this is something you capture well too. There's this part in the book where you talk about a Persian who immigrates from the east, from Mesopotamia into the Roman Empire, then rises the ranks to actually become a general or some sort of military leader. And so there's this idea that something that we often forget is how like multinational or multi-ethnic the Roman military in particular was at this time, but the Roman Empire in general. You had immigrants from the Goth region, you had immigrants from Persia that were in many respects integrating in different echelons of society.
Yeah. And the sources, like we said, are really kind of scrappy and fragmentary, but there's that scrap that comes from one of the writers, the documentary writers of Alaric's day, is someone who just exists as threads of information now. Like the major Roman historical writers like Ammianus, Marcellinus, whom some of people watching might know. He's like the Livy or the Tacitus of this day. I mean, he's the person you start with if you're going to start from Rome. He's 30 books, and some of them, a lot of them survive, and you would usually start with him. Well, by the time you get to the 5th century, it's ellipses and just really kind of frustrating fragments. But one of the fragments that we have is exactly about this point, and it's the story of those two Goths who they went to dinner at the imperial palace, and while they were there, there was a dinner party, and they got into a fight, and the two Goths were fighting about whether the Goths as immigrants should be content or kind of grateful that the Romans had taken them in and at least had given them, something to improve their fortunes, or the alternate point of view at the table, that the dining room, was the Romans had not gone far enough, that life was still too difficult for many of the Gothic immigrants who had come and settled on the land. They were being stolen by slave traders. They had the barest necessities of life, but no more. And that, to me, that debate right there, that sense of two immigrants debating with themselves about their present fortunes and how to achieve more political integration through two different strategies. Do we keep saying, yes, this is okay, thank you? Or do we say, like, enough is enough, I'm getting really tired of the way that we're being treated? To know that there were so few things left behind, but to know that conversation was preserved in the evidence, to me was just, it was like, I was so grateful to have that, because that conversation ends in a bloody murder. The Goths get into a shouting match that devolves into a dagger fight, but it totally sums up what I think is the range of approaches that people like this general you mentioned, or people like Alaric, would have felt. And to me, again, historical sensibilities, I wanted to try to capture that entire range in the story.
So the other thing that comes up a lot is religion. So this is religion for breakfast. We talk about religion on this channel, but the late Roman Empire famously being Christianized. Emperor Theodosius making Christianity the state religion and actively suppressing other ways of doing religion, the traditional Greco-Roman cults. And
Are we gonna do we say paganism or do we not say paganism?
We can say paganism, I guess. For those in the audience that don't know, a lot of religious studies scholars of the late Roman Empire try to avoid using the term pagan. I don't know what reasons exactly. Like it's.
I am so. Can we mentally press pause just for a second on this point? Yeah. Like I am so like we're gonna run it. Like I am. Yeah, let's do it. I've had like a conversion. I don't know about you, Andrew, but like I've come to this point where I'm so over the policing of language and this idea of like, well, you can't say this and you can't say like in the scholarship. It's like, well, this isn't the way they refer to it. You can't, this isn't appropriate. Like at some point, we're just going to have blank pages of scholarship because people words. They're going to be like, well, we can't say anything anymore.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, like the word. I mean, this is the problem with religious studies is we're constantly trying to pull apart the word religion, and like when you use the word religion, you got to know what you're talking about. Like, do other fields have this problem? Like, do historians have trouble using the word history?
I think it comes out like this is just my Catholic, my 21 years of Catholic education coming out, but like it totally reminds me of the apophatic theology. It's like, at God some point, the only way we can approach the mystery is just by not talking about it. So it's just like, it's very ironic to me that that's like a thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, didn't mean to interrupt us.
No, that's a good point. I mean, apophatic theology, from my understanding, is like we can't say what God is, but we can say what he's not. So it's kind of like this negative space theology. But yeah, I study magic as well. Like, what is magic? We're constantly pulling apart the category. So yeah, we can say pagan. I guess to help the audience, like pagan comes from my understanding, it's more of a pejorative term at least in the Christianized Roman Empire, as someone who lives in the hinterlands. So if you're a paganus, you are a hillbilly, uncultured, and so it was used as a pejorative. So many scholars will try to say like, oh, this person was a worshiper at the cult of Aphrodite, or like try to focus on more regionalized cult practice as opposed to this big blanket term pagan. But
yeah, and I think, like, let's be fair too. Like, at some point when you're in the weeds, when you have a point to be made and you need every piece of the argument to be lined up and precise, because you're going to make that pitch to the two readers, reviewer 1 and reviewer 2, who are going to sign off on the fate of your life. You need that level of precision. I think, when I did my studies of the word, paganus, I was very attuned to that. Like, I wanted to be attuned to that. But I think in a book like, this, speaking to a much wider audience, I just didn't have, my editor would have probably, like, I don't know, canceled the contract or something, like, had I tried to go into any of this. And in there too, it's like, even if I did, I think whole pages of it would just be cut because it just didn't translate for the audience that I was writing to. So, I try to teach my students how the word pagan develops as a term and where it comes from within kind of Christian conversations of the 4th century. But in this book, like, if we're, talking about the religion in Gothia, before the missionaries came to Gothia, it was a pagan religion. Like, we can just, go with that.
Yeah. I guess the phrase traditional Greco-Roman cults is just too long of a phrase to continually use over and over again in a book.
In traditional Gothic cults, you could probably say that, the traditional Gothic cults would have been what you had before Christianity arrived.
Yeah. So we're talking the 390s though. So at this point, like, Christianity is entrenched in the Roman bureaucracy. Theodosius famously super Christian. People often talk about the legalization of Christianity under Constantine with the Edict of Milan, but Theodosius takes several steps further with just enforcing it. But by the time Alaric is showing up on the scene, he's Christian, right?
Yeah, and there's no record of think about it just for a second with that kind of modern analogy. Like, there's no record of baptism, there's no record of any type of conversion scenes. So we just know that at some point he becomes Christian. But there are stories of what Gothic religious life was like, and the things that I think are the most intriguing are how similar they are to life in the Greco-Roman world, the traditional pagan Greco-Roman religions. They were clearly centered on communal activity. There was a sacrifice involved, usually an animal. There was a meal afterwards involving the sacrificial animal, as best as we can tell from the story of a very famous martyr. So we're using a text and then kind of reading against the grain to kind of reverse engineer what the dominant culture would have looked like, since this is a window into a very kind of niche group. But we get this sense of a kind of communally practiced religion involving meals and sacrifice and everyone coming together as a result of it. So that we know was kind of by and large the way religion operated. We also hear a very famous story of when the Goths immigrated during a period of civil war and outside invasion. When they crossed the Roman border, they brought with them they're referred to as kind of accoutrements or trinkets of their old religious practices. And there's no archaeological evidence that I know of to kind of immediately illustrate this, but I think you can imagine kind of statues or little kind of shrines or dedication pieces that might be precious to someone that they would want to hold on to. And so we have that sense of it being very tangible and also being very communal at the same time. And then we also know that Alaric was Christian. So how you connect those dots, it was one of those points in the story where I probably could have said or made more explicit, like, we don't know how to connect these dots. But there too, this is a story in which I wasn't gonna frustrate my readers by stopping every paragraph and saying we don't know. So yeah. It just would have been too maddening.
Right. Say as much as we know. And how much? So I know that Aryan Christianity. This is Arian. So the sort of Christianity that followed the priest Arius. This debate is relevant here as well, right? Where many of the Gothic Christians were of the Aryan Christianity strain or branch.
What we know is that later Gothic Christians became very, very big proponents of the creed that was associated with Arius, the one that was eventually kind of developed at Rimini in the middle of the 4th century. What we don't know exactly is, the demographic numbers or the breakdown between how many Goths espoused the Nicene version of Christianity versus the Arius form of Christianity, because we do hear stories. The story of the sacrifice of the meat, for example, comes in a martyr tale that involves Nicene practicing Christians. So, you could probably put a footnote here and just say, not all Goths were Arian Christians, like many were Catholic Nicene Christians. But we just don't know how it shook out. Largely, though, the first missionary is responsible for kind of sending them on what we see as this historical trajectory. The first missionary was this, really kind of enigmatic, but also kind of really trailblazing figure called Little Wolf. I mean, he changed his name. He adopted a Gothic name, Wulfila, that they gave him for living in their villages, for sharing Bible stories with them, making translations, developing script. He was someone who practiced Arius' form of Christianity, and so that's why we think most of the Goths embraced that form of it.
And Little Wolf, he translated the entire Bible into the Gothic language, right? And it remains one of the few texts we have in that language.
That's exactly right. So, Gothic letters and the Gothic language do still come down to us because of his efforts. So the very famous Gothic Bibles that we have the best preserved that I know of are in Sweden, are a product of that missionary work.
That's kind of amazing too. I mean, I feel like there are some languages in ancient studies that we only have a few lines of it, but if you have the entire Bible, and that's pretty sizable treasure trove for linguists.
It's fantastic. I mean, I remember thinking it when I was kind of doing my proto-Gothic studies. As I'm someone who I got into ancient history because of languages. Like it was, 13-year-old me learning Latin instead of going to practice. Like I was just absorbed in ancient languages, and that's something that has stayed with me, even though I now do regularly more kind of archaeological or material culture work. And when I was starting the Gothic kind of script and picking the 18th, 19th century grammars off the library shelf when you could still go to the library, the thing that really fascinated me about what we do have is that we have the entire Lord's Prayer. I mean, we have the Ata Unsar, the Our Father, and it always, when I was back trying to figure out what this book was going to look like, and I was in that kind of brainstorming storytelling mode, because I don't know how you make your episodes, but like I have I like just kind of having a good narrative arc to them and making sure things are in the right place, and that a reader can feel like there's a momentum and whatnot. That I just loved this idea of the Goths and Romans kind of fighting each other, but doing so with the same prayer. It's like it kind of immediately started. Like I never did anything with it. I never used anything like that in the book, because it was just I was in the realm of speculation, but it was through imagining the power of the fact that these two people who seemed so different, who had such an antagonistic relationship, eventually did recite the same scripture but in two different languages. That almost made me like it made the Goths even more endearing to me as a Roman historian, and it made me want to kind of do them right even more, because I felt like there's just been so much misinformation heaped upon who they are.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's almost like so even though the Romans cast them as these completely different people, there is a shared religion. Even though it might be a lot of Aryan Christianity versus Nicene Christianity, but they're similar prayers. They're both saying the Our Father, whether it's in Latin, Greek, or Goth.
Yeah, absolutely. So those were, I wanted to be attuned to that.
So walk me up to the actual sacking of Rome, since this is kind of what Alaric is known for. So we leave him in the late 390s as a governor of a Roman province, and then before you know it, 410, he's marching into Rome. So what brings him up to that point?
Yeah, the last part of the book was really I'm not gonna lie, it was really fun to write, because whereas the first part was really hard and kind of I had to bring out all my sensibilities of what adolescence or kind of an early immigrant's life would be like. The latter half, just immediately the models were so much clearer. It's the secret planning of an attack on a capital. So the pieces of how that fell into place were really kind of fascinating to try to collect. And in many ways, I feel like what I hope is that the narrative brings out the reasons why Alaric attacked much more clearer than let's say a very kind of simple kind of ordering of this happened in Alaric's life. Then he was fired from his job and yada yada yada. He eventually he attacked. There were so many more things happening in the early 5th century while he was governor that I feel like really pushed him on this path. And one of them is a revolt that takes place in the Eastern Mediterranean. There's another Gothic leader, another charismatic leader who's got a kind of group of followers that are really discontented with the way they're being treated in their towns. And they try to demand change from the government in Constantinople. And one thing leads to another. The revolt kind of is put down, and there's a huge conflagration in Constantinople. Churches are burned. There are riots in the streets. Goths are kind of driven out of their homes, and all this takes place while Alaric is in his government position. And by 400, 401, we can't connect the dots historically, but we can put the dots together in a narrative and maybe see that what's happened is he's grown a little wary of, whatever trust he had invested in the government to maybe do right by him had kind of been squandered. And so by 401, we see him turn to try to, really lash out. I mean, and attract kind of attention for what he feels like is unjust treatment of other Goths. He, turns mostly to the west because the east literally fires him from his job by redrawing the territory that he's in charge of. So his direct report literally kind of wants nothing to do with him anymore, and he has to turn to the west. And by 401, 402, we begin to see him start to develop a little bit more of a rapport with officials in the Western Palace, officials who also happen to have complicated backgrounds. The general Stilicho is a Vandal. He becomes very important to Alaric's later career. That relationship is really the thing that keeps Alaric going. 402, 403, 404. Until Stilicho himself is killed, and the government is just really, kind of going a little fast. So just interrupt me if you need me to. But the government is really kind of wary of a Vandal and a Goth even meeting and talking to each other, let alone kind of thinking they might be planning, a takeover of the state or something that might give greater space to the immigrants' cause. That kind of xenophobic urge that had been, mostly present for Alaric's life inside Roman society just comes out, and Stilicho is murdered. And it really is the thing. The sources are clear on this. Stilicho's murder, the murder of a foreigner, is really what convinces Alaric that he's had enough. It's too much. So at that point, we see the first of his attacks. He attacks 3 times, but it's the murder of a foreigner that is really the thing that kind of pushes us right up to the climax of the story.
Yeah. And again, going with this theme of immigrants in these positions of power in the Roman Empire, whether it's a Vandal, a Goth, or a Persian leading an army, it almost seems like Alaric is like a Moses figure in some respects when he's leading groups of Goths into the Italian peninsula, asking for a place to live.
Yeah, these people are extraordinarily loyal to him. I mean, I just couldn't conceive of how much they depended upon him, and they clearly trusted him. And what's really, I think, unfair or really misses the point is the obsession of the scholarship on whether to describe the people trailing behind Alaric from town to town as he's trying to figure out his new life, and they're trying to figure out how they can get better access to clothes and food and job, way of life, maybe learn some language, but that's not going to come immediately. The scholars are obsessed with trying to describe, are they an army or are they a burgeoning nation? And, and you think about what they're going through these years, and to me, the only kind of fair explanation is that they're poor and disenfranchised is what they are. And the idea that there is this group of people, though, that are trying to kind of make their lives better by hitching their star to Alaric is what gives rise to the idea of the Visigoths. The Visigoths, when we finally meet them, are the people who are carrying on Alaric's life's mission. But they are not some kind of genetically pure, even if we could do it, DNA kind of
right, some ethnic
race.
Nation state.
Exactly. If you felt touched by what Alaric stood for, you could join the people who were kind of following along with him. You could be a Roman, you could be a Persian, you could be a Greek. And so that idea of kind of thinking about his followers as though they're just some ethnically pure group, it's really kind of erroneous, because and the idea of, are they a nation or an army is really not helpful, because they're really just trying to make their lives better, and the Roman government seems determined not to help them.
And this leads him to the gates of Rome itself. So to the credit of your book, like the actual attack in 410 is not like the point of the book. The point of the book is Alaric and his journey.
You.
Yeah,
That's so. I mean, you're the first person to say that. You're the first person to say that. I appreciate that.
Cool. Yeah, good for me, I guess. But like, if this was a Hollywood movie script, for example, if this was a Hollywood movie script, that is what the whole movie would be driving to: the attack on Rome, August 410 CE. But this is the thing that looms so large in many Roman authors' memories. I mean, Jerome, the famous Christian leader, like, seems to weep over it and goes into this period of mourning, throwing himself into the study of the book of Ezekiel when he hears word that Rome was sacked. So it was this tectonic shift, at least for many of the Roman intellectuals at the time. So I guess, number one, what happened with that attack, and number two, what was the aftermath, and what were the Roman authors, like, what was the result to how the Romans thought of it?
Yeah, I mean, St. Augustine, from the little small town outside the smaller town, outside Carthage, says that there were days of grief and public mourning all across the Mediterranean. We know people left their homes. We know fortunes were lost. But like, just to go back to your point about whether this climax could have been told as a kind of Hollywood set piece, to me the storytelling is always in the service of doing a historical analysis. The reason for narrative is not narrative's sake in historical writing. The reason is to package important points of the history of ideas. And the history of ideas, the climax of the story is that this moment, 410, becomes the period in which Christians are convinced that the God-given empire has had its head cut off, and they're starting to live in the end times of what had been predicted by the Bible. And that is a very kind of frightening, scary, we can say apocalyptic approach to understanding historical events. And it takes generations of Christians to walk their friends and neighbors back from that level of just existential despair. The very first person to do it is the Christian writer Orosius, who happens to be friends with Jerome and Augustine. I think far less well known by the wider public than either of those two figures. But it's Orosius who asks around after 410, who starts to kind of compile an explanation for what happened, and even says, the Romans, they picked up their life after the attack, and they tried to put their lives back together again, so that if you went and took a tour of the city after 410, it would almost look like nothing had happened. And Orosius, I think, gets a really bad rap in our modern history, because he seems to be so complicit in the idea that the end hasn't come, because the Bible doesn't match directly onto the story of Rome, whereas the more kind of hardcore preachers wanted to insist that it did. But by the Middle Ages, everyone read Orosius. The Islamic, settlers of Spain, after they conquered the Gothic Spain, loved passing down, copying, finding Orosius, because Orosius's vision of the world is a vision of everyone finds a way to get along. And if if the Goths and the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews of the old Roman Empire can just understand that they're not living under this threat of a looming apocalypse, then you might be able to have a kind of peaceful coexistence of a society with obvious, all of the obvious wrinkles and road bumps that are going to happen in antiquity. So I think the heart of the book is really, like you said, how do people interpret 410? How do they find meaning in it, both in the aftermath as residents of the city of Rome and as wider participants of this global society? And then ultimately, a lot of that for me was driven out of the fact that, the interest for me was driven out of the fact that we find surprising players historically help kind of pass that down. So it was the Islamic scholars who really do a good job of kind of giving us access to what happened after 410. And then if you've carried all the way forward to the present, I think one of the things, just to cycle back, that always really annoyed me is the way in which the scholarship on the later Roman Empire just line item vetoes 410 from like the timelines of major books. The previous generation was of researchers was so intent on downplaying what Alaric did, because we knew that life bounced back, that he was just kind of, you could just literally pencil eraser him out of anything that happened. And I'm not making this up. Like, major books just ignore him because of this kind of ideological idea that life went on. It's kind of a Roscius's approach, but life went on in the context of major societal collapse. And I wanted to make sure I did justice to all of the ways that 410 played out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I do seem to remember 410 popping up in like a high school textbook, but the date that usually comes up, it's like 470, 474.
476, yeah.
476.
End of the Western Roman Empire, yeah.
Yeah, so that's usually pointed more as, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So, like, why is that? Why do we all seem to focus on the 470 but not the 410?
I mean, I think the 410 is like you said, it's so dramatic, or it seems so dramatic, that the natural instinct to someone who is being kind of pedantic and precise is to say that it's overblown. And so if it's overblown, then the way in which we can put into context is by downplaying it. I mean, I don't think that's right. 476, the Constitution changes, basically, to put it in short terms. In 476, there's a monarchy again, basically installed in Rome, and it's not by anyone who's associated with the Roman government. So at that point, we can see a kind of the partnership between Constantinople and Rome is broken in a way that is very cataclysmic for the history of Rome. So 476 is that moment that I think we lead up to, but for me, rewinding the story, maybe 2 generations, 476 to 410, 2.5 generations. I think that's what was so ultimately so intriguing about trying to tell his story with an eye on what we know happens, within 4 or 5 decades. The problems that Roman society is facing when it confronts Alaric's discontent are problems that it would not resolve, and it did not resolve them. So the idea that you would find a way to incorporate foreigners into your society is something that, even though Rome had done it 3 times before, it would not reopen that question. It would not reopen that kind of political conversation. And it's very clear that that's one thing that Alaric finds distasteful.
So I want to get your opinion on something that has always bothered me, which is how little the late
Sure.
Roman Empire is depicted in modern media. I mean, we have HBO Rome talking about, first century, Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus. We have Gladiator, which is like right after the reign of Marcus Aurelius, so getting a little bit later. But when you see the Roman Empire depicted on screen, it just seems to always be, first century or earlier. But the late Roman Empire is just so freaking interesting. Like you could do it.
I'm ready. I'm ready to do it with you if you want. Is that the pitch?
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, I'm thinking of Game of Thrones. Like everyone's intrigued by Game of Thrones with the political machinations, the battles, and like what better series than 5 seasons focusing on Constantine leading up to Theodosius, leading up to Alaric. Like, oh my God, like it's just like it writes itself.
I'm right there with you. I'm right there. I mean, the thing that just jumped out to me from a casting point of view was that you've got this Alaric guy who by the time he attacks is like 40. So he's pick your 40-year-old warriorish, handsome type to put into this political situation. And then who is really like the nemesis, like who's the face of this recalcitrant kind of stubborn government? It's an 18-year-old, and like the dynamics there I think are so, not without reading too much onto the past, I'm, just riffing off your question here, but the dynamics there are so interesting. What was Alaric thinking when he went into these, by 408, high level negotiations with this person who is basically half his age? And, who's just adamant that he's not going to talk to him. He's not going to give him what he wants. He's not going to have, Honorius, the emperor, just flat out refuses at one point to say, we're not going to give Alaric anything that he's asking for, and not even anyone in his family. The interpersonal dynamics of this period are perfect for filming. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah, like a King Joffrey character maybe with the Honorius. I mean, I just want to know why, because like I feel like the fall of the Roman Empire, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, like that phrase is known and people have learned about that period of time, and yet it just has never been done justice. And I just don't know why, because I just feel like even like the Julius Caesar, his lifetime, like that also is worthy of cinema, and I'm glad it's been covered. But like it's just as cool, if not equally as cool, if not cooler, to think about what was happening before the 5th century.
How many stories from like the classical past can we get? How many times can we get the same story over and over again? I mean, I'm all for like new things, doing something differently. Like why not, later Rome? It just seems, I don't know. Is it like, I can't make sense of it. It's not like, I mean, you look on Amazon and the number of people who are still reading Edward Gibbon, like, or Reddit or whatever, it's like, oh yeah, this it's good, but it's not as good as Gibbon. It's like, give me a break, guys. It's like, pick up another book. But I think I was going to say that sense to which he kind of dominates the mental landscape of things doesn't really excuse the fact that there hasn't been a movie. Because I mean, you could easily take Gibbon and turn it into an HBO series. The question of whether it would be like right or not is, another thing. But I don't know. I think people, I think the themes in this story, the themes of Alaric, I hope are really kind of timely. Like I started it 4 years ago, like I said, because I was looking at a world in which, like, I was very upset with how slow change was coming to kind of a more inclusive world, and so I thought that Alaric would be the perfect person to kind of help explore those things historically. And now, fast forward 4 years, I think the power of any story, whether it's Game of Thrones, whether it's Alaric, is when those themes can connect with the readers or with the viewers. Then they make them what they will. Maybe what we've seen is that the late Roman Empire's themes, xenophobia, fear of outsiders, just cultural supremacy run amok, there's lots of vehicles for those now. I mean, there's lots of ways in which we explore those in much more kind of settings that hit closer to home. And And maybe it's because this material is, we can't get history right from 60 years ago. Like, that's kind of sad. We know it's inexcusable is like, we're making the same mistakes they did 1,000 years ago, thousands of years ago. Like, it's unconscionable. So I just hope that that's how people see it.
Yeah. I mean, I heard it said that history is how the present thinks about and talks about the past. And I can see the threads in your book, how the themes of immigration and xenophobia and feeling like you're an outsider, even though you've been an insider for so long, in the case of Alaric as a freaking governor. It's definitely a strong resonance with today as well.
I just hope that the thing that I told myself all throughout, and I had very good guidance. I think as a writer, I think I've, pat myself on my back. I think I've grown up a little bit. And the goal for me throughout was just to tell his story in a way that would be recognizable to him, and to do it with a sense of the complexity of the choices that he made. He is talented. He is thoughtful. He is trustworthy. He's rash. He's easily fired up by a sense of injustice, and he's someone who dies a failure. I wanted to make sure that picture was there, and that's what I focused on. I didn't, if people see the parallels, or people want to read it and see parallels between now and then, they're perfectly happy to. I'm not going to stop them. But for me, the most important thing was to make sure that I told his story in a way that was that did him justice.
Yeah, and I think those themes did come through, and using the analogy of a Moses-like character, like he was trying to lead his people to North Africa, where he saw as a possible land to settle, and like the failure to actually emigrate there and to die in Italy, right? He didn't make it to his promised land.
Correct. Yeah. He died. What he died of, we're not sure. But he died in Calabria, and that's allegedly where he's buried. The Religion for Breakfast audience is probably going to be fascinated by who has gone in search of his tomb, because after he attacked Rome, we know that one of the things that he burned was probably the form of peace, which was thought to be the holding place, or the safe deposit box for the temple treasures from Jerusalem. And so there's a kind of huge weird historical obsession of people trying to find Alaric's tomb because they want to find the Jewish temple treasures. And one of the I don't want to give too much space to it, but it literally comes right out of Indiana. Like, it could pass for Indiana Jones. You've
Right.
got like the 1930s crew coming down to southern Italy to dig up the riverbank to try to find, the real life version of the Ark of the Covenant. I mean, it's kind of absurd if it weren't. But no one's ever found it. No one's ever found his body. No one's ever found, his tomb. But the town, Cosenza, has set up a really extraordinary modern memorial to him. Really kind of tall, life-size bronze statue. And I had a chance to see it right like a couple of days after it was unveiled. And, it was nice to be able to kind of stand at that river where he died, in part because the statue was placed at the intersection of two rivers. And there's one image that comes up time and time again in the sources, as thin as they are. And that's the Goths always marveling at how Rome was like... The Goths just couldn't understand, in a good way, how so many people in Rome could come together from different backgrounds, different religions, different ethnicities, as if they were multiple streams, multiple rivers flowing into one. And to me, the sources who describe Alaric's death, Jordan in particular, always place it at the banks of one river. But when you go there, you see that the town is the confluence of two rivers. And that was really, I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better ending, because I think it really captures what he stood for throughout his life, which was a sense of trying to be both things. He was trying to and live up to the vision of what Rome had been. Rome had been welcoming. Rome had been a place of confluence. But by the time he died, it wasn't it wasn't meant to be.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to end. Was there anything really that you feel like we missed that should come out?
Oh, I mean, I'm just happy I made it. I made it this far. I'm not good at these things. So this is it was just fun to kind of sit here and do this with you. You're a good host.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And you're a good writer. So like you mentioned briefly how you want to pat yourself on the back. I'm an academic. I read a lot of academic literature, and it's skull-numbingly boring and difficult to read sometimes, but this book is not. So for those that are watching, it's Alaric the Goth. I'll have a link to Amazon in the video description and comments below. But Douglas, thanks for stopping by.
Andrew, thanks so much, and continued success. I'll tell everyone that I know to like and subscribe.
Thanks.